All right, I am here, everyone. I was live in another event. Of course, I'll let people join now. No one's here yet, so I'm talking to myself. But okay. All right. Now I'm seeing some people join. And let me go back to my other page so I can get the discussion going. Okay. All right, Crystal, looks like you found us. I saw your comment, Brandon, right there. And so I see your comment. Although last time it started this way, so hopefully it will continue to show me the comments. Let me pull it up. I'm going to pull it up on my phone as well anyways, so I can follow here, because I do not want to keep talking as I barrel over people's questions like I did last time. Welcome, Kinsey, with your two sons. Welcome to you as well. Hopefully this will be a little more entertaining than a standard history lecture. And Brandon, let's have you, if you wouldn't mind, posting another. Let's have you post another question to see if it's good to make sure that I'm going to see the. All right, welcome, Bonnie and Karen and Linda. We're giving people just a moment since I was a little late starting due to some technical difficulties and also me difficulties. I can't completely blame technology. I also had a hand in the technology failing, so I can't completely write it off. And I'm going to have, those of you that are here, just have you type in a comment. I want to make sure that I'm going to see the comments this time, unlike we did last time, because I would like to respond to the questions as they come in. And I'm going to pull them up on my phone as well, just so that I have a backup. Okay, I haven't seen any more oh, let's see. Oh, that's right. Thank you. That's kind of annoying. I do see the comments, but it doesn't auto, like once I scroll to a point, it stays, so I have to manually scroll down. So I'll just keep my eyes on that. There we go, new comment. I have to scroll down. And no worries, Linda. That's the advantage of doing Facebook Live events, is you can come in and out as you please. And you can fall asleep for all, because none of us know. So you can do whatever you want. You can put it on and walk into the other room. Brandon, I do not know Ulysses S. Grant's favorite color. Thank you, Bonnie, for the compliment on the tie. All right, well, let's go ahead. It is 7:10. We'll get started. Those that join late can catch up. Let me pull up. I'm just going to pull up the questions, pre-asked questions, really quick. And again, those that are here, feel free. You can use the comments to ask questions as we go. Share any comments as well. We've had lots of excellent questions asked in advance that I really could just base the whole lecture on. But to begin, I would like to take a few minutes to share a story with you about Sam. This is a man named Sam. This will all make sense and how it's related to Ulysses S. Grant in a couple of minutes. So indulge me, please, for a few minutes with this story. Some of you I know may have heard it, but not everyone. So back in the year 1852, Sam was in dire straits. He was struggling financially to make ends meet for his family. He was without any capital. He was occasionally destitute. Didn't own anything. He was working with his hands to make ends meet, basically just trying to do whatever he could, manual labor, other type of labor. The community in which Sam lived began to fill with stories of Sam's generosity. For example, he'd be returning from St. Louis with his receipts, or St. Louis, excuse me. He'd be returning from St. Louis with his receipts and earnings from the day from selling wood. At one point, Sam was so destitute he was peddling firewood on the corners of street corners in St. Louis, just selling firewood to whoever he could find. On his way home, if he had heard, one instance, he heard that someone's house had burned down, or a widow's cow had died. He would hear stories of how other people had encountered hardships of some kind as well, and he generally would hand over all of his earnings from that day on his way home from whatever he made selling firewood. Sometimes it was $1, sometimes it was $5. It was typically a few dollars. He would often say he was sorry and apologize because that $5 or what was all he had. So he'd give them everything he had. He'd apologize for not being able to give them more, but he would say he was very glad to share with them what he had. Shortly after one particular incident, he was asked to contribute funds for the building of a new church, and he contributed his funds for that for the next several months. He said to the people, we ought to have a Sabbath school for the children in the neighborhood, so he put his money towards that. When a poor man lost his mule due to a law that Sam felt was fairly unjust, and rightly so, it was somewhat unjust, Sam then spent his earnings to buy the mule back for $20 for this individual, and he gave it back to the farmer. A few days later, the policeman had confiscated the mule again, and again, Sam bought it back for $20 more at an auction. Sam eventually told this resident, you're going to have that old mule if I have to buy it once a week all summer. Sam was determined to let him have that mule. And so one time when his wife's father sent some slaves to help, Sam refused to whip them or put them to work unless they were willing. If they didn't want to work that day, they didn't work that day. He only had them work when they wanted to participate. He also labored alongside them. When they would work, Sam was there working next to them. He also actually worked harder and longer hours than he expected of the slaves that his wife's father had sent to them. So he would work with them and work harder than them. When free blacks would come through the city looking for work, Sam would gladly employ them. Of course, he had very little money to pay them, but often in that time, free blacks made very little money anyway, so they were happy with whatever they could get. And he would try to pay them more than anyone else did. Multiple neighbors began to complain that Sam was spoiling these hands that he'd hired to help. And so they expected more when they came to work for the neighbors. At one point, in Christmas of 1857, Sam's wife was expecting their fourth child. And Sam had one possession left at this point. It was his pocket watch. It was his last valuable possession. And so 3 days before Christmas, he pawned his pocket watch for $22 so he could buy some gifts for their four children. In spring of 1858, so a few months later, the cold weather crippled their crops, and Sam and his wife were both overcome with an extreme sickness. Their son then developed typhoid fever, so their crops are failing. Both of them are in bed sick. Their son comes down with typhoid fever, and this little boy, Fred, was near death for several weeks as the family was preparing for the worst. They had fevers and chills all summer. Eventually, the typhoid faded in the fall, and then they all came down with malaria. They swapped typhoid for malaria, so things were not going very well for them. On one particular night, when Sam was in St. Louis, again, he had been selling firewood for the day. He was on his way home, and he passed an old colleague of his. And this colleague, several years before, when Sam had been serving in the military, had loaned Sam $5 about 15 years before. And Sam saw him, and the man came up to him first, and he says, "Why, Sam, what in blazes are you doing here?" And Sam responded, "Well, General, I am hauling wood, and I am solving the problem of poverty," was his very direct answer. And then later, in 1858, some comrades found Sam and noticed that he was just a mere ghost of a soldier. With the disheveled look, he just looked very unkempt, was in very needy circumstances. They could tell immediately by his appearance. And then this comrade came to him after he learned that he was there. And excuse me, I got my years mixed up. So this is the particular instance where his comrade gave him the $5 now. A moment ago I said it was before, but this is when his comrade found him and gave him $5. And then from this point, 15 years into the future, Sam encountered this colleague again on the battlefield, and he immediately put a $5 gold piece into the general's hand. He says, and the general tried to refuse to take it, and Sam said, "You must take it. I cannot live with anything in my possession which is not mine." Eventually, Sam became a rent collector, but he didn't have the heart to evict people who couldn't pay their rent. He tried to sell real estate, but he was too honest to sell real estate or any properties. His only drive, this is a neighbor said, that was Sam, his only drive was to do what was right, and he had no other ambition except to educate his children and take care of his family. When Sam's father complained to Sam that he had no business qualifications whatsoever, and Sam had failed in everything, Sam's father told Sam that he wished he could make him over again, because he was a failure at everything that he tried. Eventually, the man responded, "The truth is that Sam is the only one of the family that has any soul in him," those that knew the family. One friend eventually said Sam had not the slightest suggestion of any business talent, but he was the perfect soul of honor and truth, and believed that everyone else was simply as guileless as himself, as innocent as he was. There was a lawyer who worked with Sam, and he said he just doesn't seem to be calculated for business at all. But a more honest and a more generous man never lived. I don't believe he knows what dishonesty is or how to tell a lie. Well, in these circumstances that continued for 7 years, eventually near the end of 1859, March of 1859, I mentioned a few moments ago that Sam's father-in-law, was a slave owner. Sam was not, but Sam's father-in-law was from the South. And then he inherited a slave, Sam did. And it was a 35-year-old male, very valuable at the time, very hardworking slave. And Sam was aware of the immense financial benefits that he could reap from renting William out. The name of his slave was William. He could rent him out for a steady income, or even sell him for a large enough sum of money to solve all of his financial troubles. Well, instead of doing these things, on March 29, 1859, Sam went with William down to the circuit courthouse and signed the manumission papers, freeing William and giving William what money Sam had so that he could start a new life and set William free. Sam never spoke of this himself, actually. We only learned about this many years later when people found the records of it and then confirmed it. Well, as I've been telling you this story about Sam, you may be wondering what this has to do with Ulysses S. Grant. Again, those of you that joined us a few minutes late, at the beginning I asked for your patience to indulge me as I told this story about Sam. And I wanted to tell it in this way. Sam was actually a nickname for Ulysses S. Grant. This man that I've been describing was Ulysses S. Grant. Now, we could honestly ask how many of you, and again, if you already knew this and you don't need to answer, but how many of you genuinely thought I was describing the man that you have been taught is Ulysses S. Grant? So maybe think about that for a moment. Who was Ulysses S. Grant to you? What were you taught about who he is? I would wager a guess that the man I just described and all those experiences is not the person that you were taught in high school was who Ulysses S. Grant was. And so that was Ulysses S. Grant, of course. He went through this poverty. He endured these trials, eventually rising above them to not only become the President of the United States, but one of two saviors of our nation during the Civil War, and even a world traveler after his presidency. Years after this, he would be dining with kings and queens and princes, traveling throughout the world as a former president. And I did see a question about was the S in Ulysses S. Grant for Sam? It actually was not. And so going back to the birth of Ulysses S. Grant, to make it maybe even a little more confusing, he wasn't born Ulysses S. Grant. He was actually born Hiram. His given name was Hiram. Hiram Ulysses Grant is who he was born as. He went by Ulyss for most of his childhood. Occasionally he'd go by Hiram. Now, you're probably wondering, where did the name Ulysses S. Grant come from? So I will jump ahead a little in the story to when he went to West Point as a teenager. Now, at that time, to go to West Point, your congressman in your state, they had to actually nominate you. They had to support you to go to West Point. It wasn't, you didn't just apply. And so the congressman in Ohio nominated Ulysses to go to West Point for a few special skills that Ulysses had that I'll share with you in a moment. But Ulysses went back to West Point, and by the time he got there, he went to check in, and the congressman didn't know Ulysses very well. And so he had mistakenly written down his name as Ulysses Simpson Grant, U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. And Hiram Grant shows up and he says, "That's not my name." He's like, I'm not Ulysses S. Grant. But the clerk at West Point says, "Well, this is what we have on the record, so if you want to go to school here, you will be Ulysses S. Grant." So he's like, "Well, okay," and he went to school and debated changing it, but eventually, after a quiz in his first year, he saw that the grades were posted, and they had abbreviated initials for their names, and people began saying, "Oh, U.S. Grant, who's U.S. Grant?" And Ulysses thought, "That's kind of a patriotic name. I like it. I'm going to stick with it." So he kept, he liked the initials U.S. Grant, and he kept the name Ulysses S. Grant, even though he was born Hiram Ulysses Grant. And so that's how he was known for the rest of his life and in the history books. Now, the skills that got him in there, I mentioned there were some unique skills that got Ulysses into West Point. Ulysses S. Grant is perhaps the most equestrian president we've ever had. We've had several presidents that are very into horses, very skilled at horseback riding, especially Ronald Reagan, actually, and we talked about last week. Ronald Reagan is very skilled at horseback riding. But none were probably quite as skilled as Ulysses S. Grant. He actually has records that still stand to this day at West Point for various equestrian talents. At a very young age, it's very apparent to people that he had a gift. He was riding horses before the age of 5 without a saddle at very high speeds. He could train horses. Neighbors actually began to learn if they had a horse that they couldn't break or anyone else, they could bring it to Ulysses S. Grant, of course, Ulysses at the time when he was a child, and he could break in these horses. There was one fair coming through town. I don't recall his age. I think it was 8, but he was fairly young, Ulysses was. There was a carnival coming through the town, and this carnival was known that the ringmaster, every town they went to, he had a wild Mustang that no one could stay on, and no one could ride on this Mustang. And he offered a $5 gold piece to anyone that could stay on this Mustang. He had never paid out that bet before. Well, young Ulysses, at the age of 8, volunteers, and the ringmaster at first was like, "No, this is for adults," and the people from the town knew Ulysses, and they said, no, you want him to try. So Ulysses got on for 5 minutes, held to the back of this horse, didn't go anywhere, didn't fly off. Eventually the ringmaster got so frustrated, he decided to make it a little more challenging. So he got a monkey, and he threw the monkey on Ulysses' back. Even with the monkey on his back, Ulysses did not fall off of that horse, and he was awarded that day a $5 gold piece. So his skills with horses were amazing. He was actually his heart. Let's take a moment to talk about the heart of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, I'll tell you just briefly, I'm not going to necessarily go chronologically through his life. I'm going to kind of talk about different traits and attributes that he had and use experiences from his life to illustrate them, as well as his own words, in certain cases, and the words of others as they described him. But he had a heart for animals as well. Later during the Civil War, if ever he saw someone abusing an animal, he would reprimand that person. There were several instances of this happening, where he reprimanded soldiers for whipping their horses, for doing other things to their horses. Indeed, many people felt that Ulysses S. Grant got along better with horses than he did with people. He was a fairly shy person, a fairly introverted person as well. He never did swear. Ulysses S. Grant, in his own words, I'm going to share, and I do have some note cards again, as I mentioned last week. I do like to have note cards so I can get my quotations correct. But he did say the only time he thought it was appropriate for someone to swear was if they were dealing with a pack mule. Now, I need to clarify, Ulysses S. Grant loved animals, he loved horses, did not love pack mules. He was in the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s, so fresh out of West Point, in his early 20s. He was shipped off to Mexico to fight in what he actually believed was an unjust war. After that war, looking back in hindsight, he says that's perhaps the only unjust war we have fought in America, since it was a war he felt simply to get territory. It was for territorial gain. But he was a quartermaster in charge of a regiment. So he was in charge of supplying about 500 men with everything they needed. So he learned the logistics of materials, which this served him very well later in the Civil War. He understood that you can't just march into battle. You have to maintain a supply line so you have a continual supply of food and supplies and other things. Well, in the Mexican-American War, those supply lines were maintained by pack mules. He did not get along with the pack mules, so we will allow him that leniency to, was not a fan of pack mules. But when it comes to swearing, he did say the only time it was appropriate for someone to swear was when they were dealing with pack mules. And for him personally, he said, "I never learned to swear. When I was a boy, I seemed to have an aversion to it, and when I became a man, I saw the folly of it. I have always noticed, too, that swearing helps to rouse a man's anger. So logically, if a man wishes to control his anger, he might consider the language he uses. Perhaps saying, 'Confound it,' or 'by lightning,' or 'doggone it.'" And so Grant was known to have had great morals in that regard. Now, one fun story in the Mexican-American War, again, Grant was young, in his early 20s, and at this time, people, the name of his horse, let me look it up here really quick. And so Grant was Nellie, that's right. There was a particular time where they were ensconced in a Mexican town, and they were about to be surrounded, and they needed to get a message to the next regiment that was several miles away, and they were in this town that had been abandoned previously, but they were now being surrounded by Mexican troops. And so the U.S. troops needed to get this message out, and they didn't know who wanted to ride through the town with all of these buildings, with Mexican troops hiding in them and closing in on them, through the open streets, where you're just going to be a target for all of those soldiers. Grant volunteered without hesitation and got on his horse Nellie, and actually, as he was riding, he realized that the Mexican soldiers were just on one side of the town, and so he actually swung over to the side and held on to his horse as he rode through the town to deliver this message. And when he returned, doing the same thing, the soldiers were all amazed at what he did. But they did notice, they said, "But every time we tried to compliment him or say what a good job he did, he always gave the credit to Nellie. He always said, 'No, it wasn't me. It was Nellie. She was the right, she was the one that delivered me and protected me, and the one that basically saved me.'" So that was how Grant credited Nellie. Grant did have a great humility about him. As in the story I already shared, he was always thinking about how he could serve and help other people. And indeed, when the Civil War broke out, Sam, at this point, 1859, again, is when he sold his slave. And by 1860, Grant had realized that, after 7.5, nearly 8 years of failing at everything, being reminded of that by his father fairly consistently as well, he actually humbled himself to the point where he returned to his father. His father was a store clerk in Galena, Ohio, and Grant went to his father and asked if he could just work as a clerk in the store that his father owned. He was then employed there as a junior worker to his younger brother. So Grant had to swallow a bit of humility. And this is where he was working when the Civil War broke out. He was a junior store clerk working under his younger brother with a father who didn't feel his son would ever amount to anything. Now, Grant had previously been in the U.S. military. I've mentioned already he went to West Point. He served in the U.S. In the Mexican-American War. And he wanted to join immediately. He felt that this was a righteous cause, and he offered to join, and initially in Illinois, where he was now, they said, "No, we have no need of you. You were kicked out of the Army in 1852. And so they gave him, he was a volunteer colonel in charge of a ragtag regiment that was just, they didn't think would ever amount to anything. And he turned this regiment around, and throughout the Civil War had one success after another. We'll talk about a few of them in a few minutes. But I wanted to back up to when Grant was kicked out of the Army in 1852. Some of the questions that have been asked about Grant, and I could have asked you in the comments perhaps to share some of the impressions you already have of Grant. Things that when you think of Ulysses S. Grant, what do you think of? Might not be a lot, he's not hugely popular, but there might be a few things. Generally, one thing people will think of is that he was a drunkard. And actually, if there are other impressions you have of Grant, feel free to put them down there and I'll address them in a minute and perhaps explain how they're misconceptions. But one of them is that he was a drunkard. Now the thing with Grant, did Grant drink? Occasionally, yes. But Grant could not hold his liquor. Grant is the type of person that if you give him one drink, he would act as if he had had 7 or 8 or 9 compared to the average man. So that was the thing with Grant, is he got inebriated very easily. He couldn't hold his liquor. And there was one particular episode, going back to 1851. After the Mexican-American War, Grant took a position in California at Camp Salubrity. Salubrious meaning health, but it was not a healthy place for Grant. And at this point, he was married. They had 2 young kids already when Grant was sent to California. His wife was, of course, living back east in the States. She was down with her family in the South. Grant and Julia had an amazing love story. They were very close. Grant loved Julia very, very much. One time when they were courting, he actually rode 12 miles, including across a I just forgot the word I'm looking for. When the river had risen, its levels had risen because of the rain, he forded this river to go see her, rode 12 miles in the rain, and he would often do things to show his wife how much he loved her. And he was horribly depressed when he wasn't with his family. He missed them extremely much. He missed them a lot. And so when he was at Camp Salubrity, of course his family was back east, and that's typically when he would drink. He rarely drank when Julia was around, actually, and he never would go on extreme binges either. It was usually, it builds up for a few weeks and he goes and has a drink and suddenly he's drunk. And so there was one particular night in early 1852 where we don't know all the details, but it's based on what we do have, is it seems likely he got drunk and the commanding officer allowed him to just resign and go home without having a dishonorable discharge. And so that was when Grant left the Army then. Of course, the Civil War began and he re-enlisted and eventually became indispensable to our victory. Lincoln is rightly considered one of the saviors of the Civil War. We would not have won the Civil War without Abraham Lincoln, but it must be acknowledged that we would not have won that war without Ulysses S. Grant either. Grant absolutely was just as indispensable to that war as Lincoln was. And regarding Grant's drinking during the war, there were some rumors that reached Lincoln. Now, Grant began in a very small position, and as the war went on, beginning with Fort Donelson and some other forts, Grant kept achieving amazing victories because of his approach to the military, to fighting a war. And at one point, as Grant was now rising in stature, rising in prominence, the rumors began to circulate, mainly fueled by his opponents in the military that were trying to undercut him and that were trying to jockey for position so that they might look better. Most of these rumors were actually started and perpetuated by them, but it reached Grant, and this is what Lincoln said. So the rumors got to Lincoln. Let's see. And the president says, "I think Grant has hardly a friend left, based on how many rumors he was hearing, except myself. What I want, and what the people want, is generals who will fight battles and win victories. Grant has done this, and I propose to stand by him." Interestingly, Lincoln then said, "I then began to ask them if they knew what Grant drank in the battlefield, what brand of whiskey he used, telling them seriously that I wished they could find out. They conferred with each other and concluded they could not tell me what brand he used. I urged them to ascertain this question and to let me know, for if it made fighting generals like Grant, I should like to get some of it for distribution to the rest of my generals." And so Lincoln wasn't bothered by it at all. Indeed, the spy they sent, Charles Dana, was sent by the Secretary of War. These rumors reached the Secretary of War, so they actually sent Charles Dana under the guise of being a special secretary and communique with the War Department. He was actually sent specifically just to evaluate Grant's drinking habits. Well, Charles Dana's conclusion was, Grant was the most modest, the most disinterested, but the most honest man I ever knew. He had a temperament that nothing could disturb, and a judgment that was judicial in its comprehensiveness and wisdom. Not an original or brilliant man, but sincere, thoughtful, deep, and gifted with the courage that never faltered. When the time came to risk all, he went in like a simple-hearted, unaffected, unpretending hero, whom no ill omens could deject, and no triumph unduly exalt. And so that was his report to Lincoln. And Lincoln, that was good enough for him. And so yes, these rumors plagued Grant throughout most of his life, mainly fueled by his political opponents. The most recent biography about Grant, that's a really good one, by Ron Chernow, you might know from Hamilton fame, of course, the big Hamilton. Ron Chernow wrote Hamilton. His newest biography is on Grant. It's also very readable, a very great biography. He focuses quite a bit on Grant's alcoholism. And Ron Chernow actually believes that Grant might have actually suffered from a physical condition that impacted that. And he spends a lot of time discussing it, actually a little bit more so than I thought was needed. But Grant certainly wasn't a drunkard, but he would get drunk. He could get drunk quite easily. Now, during the Civil War, Grant was very unpretentious. Talking about his humility again, going back even to the Mexican-American War, there were two generals that he particularly was fond of. One was Zachary Taylor, who also became a U.S. president shortly after the war. Another one was Winfield Scott. These were the two generals in charge. And Winfield Scott was all about the pomp and the circumstance. I mean, he loved his military uniform. He was always sure to wear his uniform with all of its flourishes on the front lines. And Zachary Taylor was not like that at all. Zachary Taylor didn't care what he wore, quite frankly. And if you were to judge him by his clothes, you might think that he was an average private in the Army. But in Grant's observations, Taylor got things done. Taylor wasn't distracted by things that would take your vision from where it needed to be. And Taylor was the general that Grant kind of modeled his approach after. Grant was known to get down with his men, to walk through the camps and be with his men. Grant never wanted to wear his dress uniform or his full uniform. To him, it was just pretentious. It was arrogant. When he finally got his position as general-in-chief, he actually, they gave him stationery, and every letter he wrote, he crossed off his rank and his position. He's like, nope, just crossed it off in all of the letters that he wrote. Well, except for there were a few to some somewhat insubordinate generals under his command that he perhaps wanted to remind them. But most personal letters, he would cross that off, all letters to his family and friends. And so that was the type of leader that he was. When he went to, when Lincoln wanted to appoint him general-in-chief, so about 2.5 years into the war, Lincoln finally realized, here is a general that fights and wins. And so Grant was pulled off of the lines, taken to Washington, D.C., and he got to the hotel, this really nice hotel where he was staying, and when he, asked for a room, the clerk's like, oh, we don't have any rooms, we just have this small room out back, and Grant's like, oh, okay, that's good with me, I'll take it. And he signed his name and turned the book around, and of course by this point, Ulysses S. Grant is a household name, after his amazing victories, and turns it around, and the clerk's, what? You're Ulysses S. Grant? He's like, yeah. It's like, well, we'll put you up in the presidential suite, and Ulysses S. Grant's, no, that's just fine. And actually at the reception the next day, when he was in the White House, and the president had invited guests over to see him, and they began to rush towards him, he jumped up on the couch. He backed up and jumped up on the couch because he was so startled, and he just, didn't, like I said, he was an introvert. He didn't thrive on the attention that people wanted to give him. And so that was... and some of these we don't have a lot of time. Some of his military victories were amazing. Vicksburg, perhaps overshadowed quite significantly by the Battle of Gettysburg. They were going on concurrently. And Vicksburg, Grant was almost killed actually in this battle a couple of times. He was almost killed several times throughout the war. But Vicksburg was a 47-day siege, which ended at the same time as Gettysburg. And strategically, it was actually a more significant victory because this gave the North control of the Mississippi River. When Vicksburg fell, actually Grant wanted to make sure the Confederate soldiers were treated fairly, that they would feel welcomed back into the fold, basically, of the American family. Eventually, 30,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered, and where many of the other military leaders, many soldiers, they wanted leaders to be hung, they wanted strict penalties. Grant simply gave them parole, made them sign a paper committing to not take up arms again against their country, and instead of imprisoning them in a POW camp, he simply sent them home. It's like, you can, you just promise not to fight again and you can go home. Did some of them rejoin the ranks? Probably. But that is how Grant was considered a magnanimous man even by those whom he vanquished. Indeed, 18 years earlier when he was married to Julia, his best man at his wedding ended up being a Confederate general with whom he faced off in the Civil War and to whom he surrendered. General Longstreet surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant and took his surrender and allowed him to go home. But Grant said after the Vicksburg victory, "The men had behaved so well that I did not want to humiliate them. I believed that consideration for their feelings would make them less dangerous foes during the continuation of hostilities, and indeed better citizens after the war was over." And eventually, actually today is April 9th. Today is the anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. It was on this day. I'm not going to guess how many years. I guess it's been 155 years ago today that that Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee was not expecting very generous terms, and when he met with Grant, and Grant basically offered him, he says, "You can go home. We're not going to imprison anyone. We're not going to hold you responsible. We're not going to try you as a traitor to your country or as a rebel." And so he was so generous, he allowed the Confederate soldiers to even take home their horses and their guns and different things. And this earned him a great deal of respect in the South. And indeed, at Grant's funeral, about 22 years later, half of his pallbearers were Confederate generals whose surrenders he had accepted during the war. At one point, actually, during the Johnson administration, of course, Lincoln had died. I'm going to share this quick, and then I'll talk about the relationship between Grant and Lincoln. But after Lincoln died, Grant, of course, was still general-in-chief. He oversaw, the reduction of our army significantly. The war was over, so he had to reduce the army. He remained general-in-chief. But Andrew Johnson became president, and I don't know what you know about him and his role in history. He was one of our few presidents impeached. Not a generally highly rated president, and he is probably one of our worst presidents. He was a very stubborn man and a very racist man as well. And Andrew Johnson was hearing from many, many people in government that they wanted Jefferson Davis, they wanted the leaders of the Confederacy to be tried as criminals. They wanted them to be tried as traitors because they had rebelled against their country. And Andrew Johnson began to promote this idea. And at this surrender, again, at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant had promised Lee that this wouldn't happen. Grant had told Lee, basically, if you sign this parole stating you will never take up arms again against your country, and you promise to go home and live a life of peace, then we will guarantee you will be left alone. We will allow you to live your life peacefully as citizens. And that was the promise that Grant made to Lee. Well, Andrew Johnson didn't like that. Many other government leaders, actually most, didn't like that. Lee and Grant began to communicate as Lee was hearing rumors of this. Of course, Lee's getting nervous. He's like, yeah, Grant promised me this, but he's one man. The president and other people want us to be tried as criminals. Eventually, Grant went to the White House himself, where he talked with President Johnson about this, and Andrew Johnson was completely unyielding. The president said he wanted to use the example of these men to, in his own words, make treason odious. And Grant said, Grant told him what he could do. He says, "You can't do what I promised we wouldn't do." Eventually, Johnson ignored him, asking his attorney general, asking other people, when can these men be tried? We need to push forward with these trials. And eventually Grant stood up, says, never unless they violate their parole. And one of the few times it was said that Grant lost his temper was in this particular meeting, in this cabinet meeting. And he was very livid with President Johnson, and he says, "I made certain terms with Lee, the best and the only terms so that these men would surrender. If I had told him and his army that their liberty would be invaded, that they would be open to arrest, trial, and execution for treason, Lee would never have surrendered, and we should have lost many more lives in continuing to try to destroy him. My terms of surrender were according to military law, and so long as General Lee observes his parole, I will never consent to his arrest. I will resign the command of the army rather than execute any order to arrest Lee or any of his commanders, so long as they obey the law and keep their word. One of the few times Grant did lose his temper, and that was to the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. Grant, again, was a very quiet, shy, introverted, humble man. But when he needed to be, he could absolutely find the fury of a lion. And so that was how Grant stood up to Andrew Johnson. But going back to the relationship that Lincoln and Grant had, like I said, they were both indispensable to the war. And both of those men trusted the other more than they trusted anyone else. Lincoln, as he got to know Grant, realized he was indispensable. And Grant, as he got to know Lincoln, honored and respected him more than anyone else. There's actually, I want to read this letter that Lincoln wrote to Grant. This was after the Battle of Vicksburg. Now again, this was a 47-day siege that went on. And as it was going on, there were a lot of generals questioning if Grant's tactics were right because the victory wasn't immediate and imminent. And even Lincoln at one point thought this himself. But after the victory was won, Lincoln wrote this letter to Grant. My dear General, I do not remember that you and I have ever yet met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done this country. I wish to say a word further. When you reached the vicinity of Vicksburg at first, I thought you should do what you finally did, march the troops across the neck, run the batteries and so forth, but I never had any faith except in a general hope that you knew better than I, and that likely that could succeed. When you got below, he explains military movements, basically saying, when you got to this point, I thought that you should go down the river and do this, and I began to question what you were doing, for I feared you were making a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. And that was a letter that Lincoln had written to Grant. And after this, when people continued to berate Grant, Lincoln would say things like, Grant is my man. And so he stood by him throughout the war. Grant, when he found out about Lincoln's death at April 15th, 1865, initially Grant was invited to go with Lincoln to the theater. Grant refused and was on a train traveling north to be with family when he got word of Lincoln's assassination and began to weep openly and struggled for a time to recognize that had he gone there with, as if he had been with Lincoln, perhaps he could have saved Lincoln's life. Indeed, just the week before Lincoln's death, they had met together on the battlefield in Virginia where they had a discussion in which Grant did tell Lincoln, Mr. President, it seems as though if in the last year you've aged 10 years of a normal life of a man in his appearance, which is true, and you can see that in the pictures. But they spoke about Reconstruction. And President Lincoln acknowledged that was the great challenge, that was the great trial in question. But Lincoln had always been lenient. Lincoln had always pardoned people whenever he could. Indeed, many advisors said you pardon too many people. He wanted to pardon people. Lincoln was very merciful. And Grant indeed followed Lincoln's lead, which is why he gave such great terms of surrender to Lee at Appomattox. But Reconstruction was not something that Lincoln was then around to see. Lincoln died, and of course Andrew Johnson and Congress, controlled by Republicans, began a 3-year battle, an absolute battle to determine what would happen with the country. And Grant felt that it was his duty, when he was nominated to be president. He hated politics, never wanted to be a politician. Indeed, at one point during the war, he joked that the only office I would aspire to is to be mayor of Galena, and that's so that I can put a sidewalk from the depot to my house. And after the war, well, they put that sidewalk in, and the mayor, they hung a big banner over, and it says, Mr. General, the sidewalk is built. So, let's see the question. Brandon asks, what was Grant's wife like, and how did she feel about his role in the war as president? Julia Dent Grant, yes, she was from a slaveholding family, but she eventually adopted Grant's abolitionist views of equality for all, and she was a very supportive wife. They had a very loving relationship, a very close relationship, and Grant did with his children as well. And she never complained about his service. There were times where she was fearful, but they often brought her to Grant in his battlefield camps. If you remember, I mentioned when Julia was around, Grant wasn't depressed, so he had no need to drink. And so they kind of figured, well, let's just keep Julia with him as much as we can, and we won't run the risk of Grant getting drunk. So she was with him on the front lines quite a bit. I actually have a list of letters from Ulysses S. Grant to his wife, and I was going to open and share, just turn to any random one, because every letter he wrote talks about, he'd always mention his love for her and how much he loved her and how close they were. And so they had a very supportive and loving relationship in that regard. So I want to talk a little bit about Grant's nomination to the presidency, and then how he became president. And I'm going to find some of the things that he said about his views on politics. He did not... he was definitely considered a political outsider because he had never held an elected position before. And, I apologize, looks like I don't have that card that I was looking for. Oh, here we go. About his aversion to politics. Here's a few of the things that he wrote to people before he was nominated to be president. I have a horror of living in Washington and never intends to do it. In the 1868 election itself, he actually voted for every office except for himself. He left that one blank. He says, again, going back to the war, when people began to consider him a potential candidate for an office, he says, I do not know of anything I have ever done or said which would indicate that I could be a candidate for any office whatsoever. And nothing likely to happen would pain me so much as to see my name used in conjunction with any political office. In 1868, when the Republican nominating convention came around, Grant didn't want to be president. He had continued to serve in the Johnson administration because he was the general-in-chief. They clashed, the entire administration. They did not get along. Grant, at one point, Johnson was going on a speaking tour throughout the country, and at all the stops, Grant was getting all of the cheering and all of the hurrahs and all of the accolades, and Johnson was fed up with this. And eventually, Grant went home early. There was no love lost between these men. But many Republicans had seen how Grant had stood up to the president and how he had stood his ground on many other occasions as well. And so they did nominate him. And people that were there with him described his reaction. They said, there was no shade of exaltation or agitation in his face, not a flush on his cheek, nor a single flash in his eye. And when Grant got up to accept his nomination, he says, all I can say is that to whatever position I may be called, by your will and that of the people, I shall endeavor to discharge its duties with fidelity and honesty of purpose. Of my rectitude in the performance of public duties, you will have to judge for yourself by the record before you. It's kind of an emotionless, just basically saying, well, you know who I am, look at what I've done, look at my record, and that's what you have to go off of. In another letter shortly before this, again, someone wrote him, and this is his response, in your letter you say that I have it in my power to be the next president. That is the last thing in the world I desire. I would regard such a consummation as being highly unfortunate for myself, if not for the country. Through Providence I have already obtained to more than I'd ever hope. Everyone who knows me knows I have no political aspirations, either now or in the future, and hope to remain a soldier as long as I live. But he also said, if I can serve this country at any time, I will do so freely and without reward. And in those 3 years after the Civil War, Grant recognized the country was tearing itself apart again. Grant, he was beginning to realize the victory that had been won on the battlefield was now being undone by politicians in their legislative houses. The Southern people were now wanting to legislate away the rights of the newly freed black population. Grant would not stand for that. He realized we had fought this war to win the freedom of these individuals, and now their freedom's being curtailed and taken away by laws and other things. And so that was one reason he consented. He didn't even campaign, actually. In his speech, he closed by saying, let us have peace. because there had been no peace since the end of the war 3 years before. They had continued to fight, and there was even violence. So Grant says, let us have peace. And that was the extent of his campaigning. He gave his speech, and he went home and did nothing else for the next several months. When he won his election, when the returns came in, the first words that he went home to Julia, didn't say anything. Someone there described, they said, I've seen Grant more excited playing a game of poker when he was losing. They said, I've seen him more excited in that situation. He went home to Julia, walked in the house with his looking down at the floor, sat down in the chair, and he says, well, I'm afraid we're in. I mean, that's what he had told Julia. And so in his inaugural address even, it was a very humble inaugural address in which he was very he acknowledged his weaknesses, he acknowledged his faults, but he proclaimed to do his best. Many people thought it was naive, but it was honest, and it was very sincere. We're coming up on 8 o'clock, and I want to get to some of your questions, so we won't have a whole lot of time to talk about Grant's presidency. I did see Linda's question came in, and we had some other questions about one of the things you often hear about Grant's presidency is it was very corrupt. The credit mobilier scandal, one of the biggest ones that textbooks often associate with Grant, even though it began in 1867, which Grant was inaugurated in 1869, and for those of you mathematicians out there, have probably figured out by now that 1869 comes after 1867, so that one happened and was before Grant was even in office. But there were an unprecedented 37 investigations by Congress into Grant's administration. Congress didn't like him either. He was an outsider. He was not a politician. They reluctantly worked with him quite a bit, but they didn't like Grant. At one point, he appointed an attorney general to basically weed out all of the corruption in the government, in his administration, which was a hard task to do because there was a lot of corruption in the government at the time, especially the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they indicted about 400 government employees in 1864. And at the time, the public was fairly shocked, and they praised Grant and Attorney General Bristow for their wide-ranging, swift actions to cleanse the government of corruption. And Grant, when he wrote to the Attorney General, in his instructions, he even said, "Let no guilty man escape. Be specially vigilant, or instruct those engaged in the prosecution of frauds to be against all who insinuate that they have high influence to protect or to protect them. No personal consideration should stand in the way of performing public duty." So basically, he's saying go after everyone. And Grant didn't feel that anyone should be above the law. No one, even him. He was actually pulled over once for speeding in Washington, D.C. in his buggy, in his carriage. And the black police officer that pulled him over saw it was the president and was going to let him go, but Grant said, no, do your duty, write the ticket. And so Grant paid the fine on the spot. His carriage was impounded, and he simply walked back to the White House. He then took his buggy skills to the beach, where he would often engage in racing buggy owners on the beach. But, excuse me, some of the political elite at the time, the things that they said about Grant, it helps you understand where a lot of the rumors came from, because there was just enough reality of him during his presidency, people began to say it, and there's just enough evidence there for historians today to be able to point back to contemporary sources and say, well, look, there's this source from 1874 that says this, excuse me, so it must be right. But the way that Grant was viewed by many of the politicians at the time, for example, Henry Adams, the grandson of John Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams, so a very prominent politician at the time, he said of Grant that he couldn't fathom how such an uneducated common man could rise to the presidency and pollute this office. Grant is a primitive, he said, and he thought it was a marvel that Grant was a miracle that goes against evolution, showing that barbarous primitives can still appear to be human. He says that Grant was a pre-intellectual and could hardly think for himself at all. And that was from a Republican, a fellow Republican of Ulysses S. Grant at the time. So Grant was very independent in what he did. His cabinet most often did stand by him. Indeed, in 1872, in Grant's re-election campaign, the Democrats knew they had no one to run against Grant, and so for the last time, indeed the only time in U.S. history, the campaign, the presidential election, was between two members of the same party. The Democrats just nominated a Republican. they got a liberal Republican. Grant was more conservative. They got a liberal Republican who was opposed to Grant's policies, and they nominated Horace Greeley. And their slogan was anything to beat Grant. That was their slogan. They attacked Grant in every way possible, including his family, but Grant won 1872 with one of the biggest margins up to that time in history. Now, throughout his presidency, he accomplished many great things, which we can't touch on all of them. His treaty, the Treaty of Washington, was perhaps one of the most overlooked successes. The Treaty of Washington negotiated a peace with Britain, and it settled disputes we had with Britain going all the way back to the War of 1812. Indeed, it's when you look at the relationship we have with Britain today, it's a very close relationship. Britain is probably our #1 ally in the world. And the Treaty of Washington is what established that. The Treaty of Washington is what resolved all of our differences with Britain, and it inaugurated an era of peace and friendship. And it's actually considered by State Department historians, it's often considered the second most important and influential treaty in U.S. history, behind only the Treaty of Paris, which is what ended the Revolutionary War. And Grant spearheaded those negotiations throughout the first 2 years of his administration. And indeed, he set the precedent, which now happens a lot today. When you need to settle disputes between different countries, you go to a third party. You go to a neutral country. Today it's often Switzerland or other countries. But Grant, in their negotiations, they were the first to try this and begin this idea. Grant was also president during the first Great Depression in our country's history. Many people don't realize before the Great Depression of the 1930s, in the history books, there was already a Great Depression. Happened in 1873, in which, because of speculation, because of worldwide agricultural conditions, a depression began in which millions of Americans lost their jobs, thousands of banks closed, railroad companies were going bankrupt, and it significantly impacted our economy. And Grant's response to this is what really established the Republican Party at that time as the party of fiscal conservatism and budgetary restraint. Everybody in Congress and people were saying, just print more money, basically. We need inflation. We need to have more greenbacks printed. And Congress wanted it to happen. Everybody wanted this to happen. And at one point, Grant himself was like, you know what? Yeah, we probably should just do this because we'll print more money, we'll print more paper money, we'll put it into the market, and then people will have more buying power. But as Grant thought about it on his own with no outside input from people, he realized that wouldn't be the healthiest thing for the economy in the long run. And eventually he vetoed this bill in what's considered one of the greatest accomplishments of his presidency. He stood up for economic security and economic health. And because of that, the Depression lasted a few more years, but America pulled out of it within about 4 to 6 years, whereas Europe took 20 years. And so he was able to help set us on a course to overcome that depression. Unfortunately, that was the beginning of his second term, and a lot of support for his ideas and his policies lost public support. Now, Grant and his efforts to defend the black people, we won't talk about, I guess, his treatment of Native Americans. He was very influential in changing the views, he wanted to. He was an idealist in that regard. Unfortunately, his policies to implement them was a much more difficult thing with Native Americans. And whereas he began with high hopes and great intent, by the end of his presidency, the Great Sioux War actually was seen some of its greatest battles, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and others, because he felt as if he was a pebble in a dam trying to hold back, doing what he could. And there are some great works written dedicated completely to his efforts with Native Americans, whom he felt were generally a peaceful people. And he even invited the chief, I'm trying to think of what chief it was, he invited one of the great Sioux chiefs, I can't remember his name at the moment, to the White House, but he treated him like a head of state. He gave him a parade, and spoke with, I believe it was Great White Cloud, I can't remember, but spoke with him. And he was also the first U.S. president to ever mention Native American rights in his inaugural address, making that one of his primary platforms. And even appointed Eli Parker, who was a Native American, was actually one of Grant's most trusted advisors throughout the Civil War. He appointed Eli Parker the Commissioner of Bureau of Indian Affairs. Those things started off very well, but unfortunately, Grant realized there was very little he could do to change so much, despite his best efforts. Now, the Ku Klux Klan began to rise during Grant's administration. We're all familiar with the Ku Klux Klan and that organization. Many politicians, including many in his own cabinet, advised Grant to not intervene. You know, it's a states' rights issue. We can't send federal troops into the states. And Grant was very much a constitutionalist. He was very much a supporter of states' rights. But in the Constitution, there is a supremacy clause that says if any state's laws challenge the basic rights of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, the federal government does have the right to go in. And indeed, Ulysses S. Grant felt that any law or any treatment of African Americans that infringed upon their rights to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, if the states didn't do anything, he absolutely believed the federal government should, because these were natural laws that couldn't and shouldn't violate. And so Grant ignored many people's advice and authorized the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871 and was able to get Congress to support this. And throughout both of his terms, he regularly would send federal troops into states where they were having violence, where they were having Ku Klux Klan activity. Indeed, by the end of his first term, over 3,000 Ku Klux Klansmen had been arrested and indicted. And so he essentially, by the end of his second term, the back of the Ku Klux Klan was broken. And they ceased to exist as a very effective organization, and they wouldn't rise again, actually, for about 40 more years until Woodrow Wilson, a very racist president in the 20th century, he came to the White House and emboldened and empowered the Ku Klux Klan again. But Grant was very strong in his defense of the African American, and again because he felt that was one of the main reasons he was president, was to make sure that the victory he had won on the battlefield was maintained and that the rights of these individuals were preserved. He helped to ensure that the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, ensuring African Americans the right to vote. He said in one speech on his regret on executive power, he says, "While I remain executive, all the laws of Congress and the provisions of the Constitution, including the recent amendments added thereto," meaning those amendments, "will be enforced with rigor, but with regret that they should have added one jot or tittle to executive powers or duties." So he did regret expanding power, but he recognized that in some cases it had to be done. And so he was an ardent defender, and indeed Frederick Douglass, who, as you may know, was perhaps the most prominent of all African American academics and African American leaders in the late 19th century, he absolutely supported Ulysses S. Grant. And when Ulysses S. Grant passed away, Frederick Douglass praised him, saying that the black man had found a savior in Ulysses S. Grant. And so Grant, even though there were setbacks in his presidency, the people still loved him. He could have actually run for a third term had he wanted to, and likely won. He didn't want to. He was done. And he went on a world tour after this. And on this world tour, there could be a whole lecture just on the world tour. It was an amazing experience where he went to so many different countries, meeting with great leaders and great military leaders, all of whom were just amazed that he had given up his power after the war and shrunk, sent home all the soldiers basically and reduced our army in size. But one of the stories that I love that again shows his humility and his character was in Germany in 1878. And they were having a great banquet in Grant's honor, and the consul in charge offered a toast to Grant, and Grant responded. This consul basically heaped all this praise on Grant, saying, "If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have won the Civil War," which technically actually pretty much is true. But, the consul was saying these things, praising Grant, and Grant stopped him. He stood up and stopped him, and he says, "I must dissent from one remark of our consul, to the effect that I saved the country during the recent war. If our country could be saved or ruined by the efforts of any one man, we would not have a country, and we should not now be celebrating our 4th of July. What saved the Union was the coming forth of the young men of the nation. They came from their homes and their fields, as they did in that time of the giving of everything to their country. To their devotion we owe the salvation of this Union. The humblest soldier who carried a musket is entitled to as much credit for the results of the war as those who were in command. And that was a great example showing his character on that world tour. And when he got to Asia even, he actually helped negotiate a peace between China and Japan. He was just going there for a visit. He happened to show up at a time where there was a conflict brewing between them, and he's like, okay, and he helped them negotiate a peace. So I'm going to try to catch up on some of the questions. So, Crystal Lacey asks, what was he like as a father? And what was his relationship with his 2 children? He actually ended up having more children, and so he had 5 children in the end. Grant was an amazing father. I already mentioned at the beginning, of course, when he sold his pocket watch to buy gifts for his children. He was often seen on the ground playing with his children. When he would come home from work, when he was working in his dad's shop just before the beginning of the Civil War, he would often come in, he'd walk through the door, and he would pause and he would wait for his sons to come and attempt to tackle him, and he would drop to the floor and roll and begin to roll around the house, and they would have wrestling matches. Even in the White House, actually, if you weren't careful, you might be hit with an incoming bread bullet. He would take the rolls, he would take bread from the White House, and he would throw it at his boys, and then he would, look around like, who was it? And for every hit that he scored, his boys had to reward him after the meal with kisses. They had to come up and give him a hug and a kiss for however many times he hit them. And indeed, he had one daughter, and when she was married, when he was president and he had to give her away, that was actually very difficult for him, and one of the other few times in his life where Grant openly wept. But he had a very good relationship with his children and was very close to them. In the closing years of Grant's life, once he returned from this world tour, they actually wanted him to run for president again, and he didn't pursue it. Had he pursued it, he probably would have won again. He almost was nominated, even without his consent, at the convention. They went through many rounds, and he didn't quite have enough votes, and eventually it went to James Garfield. And everyone acknowledged at the time, had Grant actually gone to the convention, just showed up, basically, and kind of been there so people could see he would accept it, then he would have gotten the votes and nominated. But it's probably good that he didn't. He, shortly after that, developed throat cancer. He smoked quite a few cigars during the Civil War, and smoked a lot of them, and ended up developing throat cancer. And the final battle that he fought was that of trying to overcome this cancer. And he, through a few unfortunate investment opportunities and investment mistakes that Grant made, he ended up losing most of his money in the last few years of his life, and began to write articles for magazines describing battles of the Civil War so he could make some money. He didn't want to leave his family destitute. And eventually Mark Twain, you probably all heard that name, Mark Twain began to read Grant's articles and realized that Grant had a gift for writing. He had a gift for describing battlefields and describing certain events. And so Mark Twain approached him, and there was a funny story, if I can remember the... Oh, I can't recall it now. I'll have to put it in the comments after. But the first time they met was several years before, in which Mark Twain made a comment to Grant that he didn't have time to respond to. And when they met again about 10 years later, the first thing Grant did was respond to Mark Twain's questions. But Mark Twain recognized Grant had a gift, and so he worked with Grant to get him a publishing contract to write his personal memoirs. And so Grant set about doing this. He wanted to write his memoirs and get them done before he had died. And eventually Grant went to a cottage up in upstate New York, where he spent the last few months of his life in extreme pain, struggling to sleep, but striving to write this story, as the whole country, of course, was watching, following his condition, because the whole country was hoping for his recovery. He was visited at this time almost daily by old soldiers and old comrades, and he would always stand on his porch to salute and to greet them, including, again, even Southern generals. And it was just days before he finally did succumb in July of 1885 that he finished his memoirs, and it was about 2.5 days later that Grant passed away from this life. His funeral was the largest public event in New York history up until just about 40 years ago. It was estimated about 3 million people converged on the city of New York for his funeral. The funeral procession lasted an entire day, and again, half of his pallbearers were former Confederate generals whose surrenders he had accepted in the Civil War that they wanted to honor him. One person that observed this event was a young Heber J. Grant. I saw someone had a question about his interaction with church leaders, and initially early on in Grant's presidency, the persecution against the Latter-day Saints in Utah was picking up because of their practice of polygamy, and in Victorian society they were trying to pass laws to prohibit polygamy. And Grant, of course, supported those efforts, but he was also the first U.S. president to visit Utah. He came out to Utah in 1875, and when he was going through the streets of Salt Lake City, of course the streets were lined with spectators and with children singing and lots of people, and when he remarked to the general authority with them, he says, "Who are all these people?" And he says, "Well, these are the Mormons you've been told about." And Grant says, "I have been deceived." He, of course, was being nice, but at the same time, he recognized that what he had been hearing about them wasn't exactly the truth. And Heber J. Grant wrote in his journal that night, after observing the funeral of President Grant. There's two Grants there, Heber J. Grant and Ulysses S. Grant. But Heber J. Grant wrote that Grant had been a friend to the Latter-day Saints, despite his support for anti-polygamy laws, but that he came out to the state and saw the people and learned who they were. And so that was some of those interactions with Latter-day Saints. I see Karen's question, did his dad live long enough to see Grant's rise in the war and later president? He did. He still was somewhat curmudgeonly and not very supportive, but he did. Grant never did have a very great relationship, even after he's president, with his father, or with his mother as well. And and again, if you do have other questions, you can put it in the comments down there. I know Brandon had asked some great questions before, but I don't have them now, so Brandon, if you want to type some more of your questions down there about Ulysses S. Grant. We're coming up on 8:30, and so I don't want to take too much more of your time with what a great man he was. I've shown my cards in that I am an ardent supporter of Ulysses S. Grant. As historians, we do strive to be objective, but every single historian I've ever known has also been a human as well. And so all of them have their opinions, and so rather than hide mine, I try to present them in a way that is respectful of those that might disagree, while also acknowledging their right to think differently than I do, and validating both points of view and both perspectives. And so I do strive to do that. And with Ulysses S. Grant, in my studies of him, when I began working on my book about 7-8 years ago, and I just kind of, for my own benefit, I was, it's going to, write about every president. And so I kind of was curious, where would I rank the presidents? And I put my list together, and Ulysses S. Grant came in at around number 23, of the 44 men that have been president, which was even higher than most people thought, at the time. General consensus is much lower. And he's now number 4 on my list. He's climbed from that spot, he's climbed the list significantly. And in the last 20 years, there are general polls that they do every few years of presidential historians. C-SPAN and other groups do these polls. And they discovered that Grant has been the one that's climbed in those polls the most as well. He's climbed 13 spots in their esteem. And the kind of, some people have asked actually why all the misperceptions about Grant. And one of the reasons, we'll go back to answer the question that's come in, is in the early 20th century, so when Grant died, he was considered one of our 3 greatest presidents, just generally and popularly by the people. Again, a lot of the politicians, as I mentioned, weren't fans of him, because he wasn't a politician. But he was considered, with Washington and Lincoln, our 3rd greatest president. Washington was called the father, Lincoln was the martyr, and Grant was the defender of the United States of America. And then in the early 20th century, something began happening. For starters, the Civil War soldiers began dying off, so those people that were praising him began to die off. And people in the South began to romanticize the lost cause of their ancestors, Robert E. Lee and others. They wanted to promote that they were fighting for a righteous, they were righteous and noble men, and most of the historians, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, they began to be Southern historians that promoted this lost cause ideology, which by nature had to make Grant a villain. Robert E. Lee was just a noble man who was simply overcome by superior numbers. And for one of Grant's reputations was that he was a butcher, was that he just had overwhelming numbers, superior numbers that he would throw at Robert E. Lee, and he didn't care how many men died, and he didn't care how many men he lost, but he would just overwhelm Lee with numbers. Well, we actually now know that Robert E. Lee had the higher proportional casualty rate in his army. You were more likely to die in Lee's army than you were in Grant's. Yes, Grant did have superior numbers, and so did have a higher casualty count, but the ratio was higher in Lee's army. And so they began to create these myths, and Grant himself was actually very averse to violence, ironically. He wasn't a butcher. His father, when he grew up, was a tanner. Grant couldn't stand the sight of blood because he was raised by a tannery shop where the blood was just constant from animals. He couldn't stand blood, and so often he would have to, after a battle, he would want to visit the soldiers, but he would struggle to go to the field hospitals. And so that's, even if you go back to 1981, and I was going to pull it up, and I didn't, but looking at, in 1981, the first big biography on Grant was written in almost 70 years by William S. McFeely. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was heralded as a wonderful, praiseworthy, honorable work. And yet William S. McFeely, the author of this, in his estimation, he could hardly find a thing to praise Grant for. He in his book even, he writes about, well, we have to acknowledge this and that. But Grant himself was a very simple, naive, and ignorant little man that accomplished, very little. And the reviewers that were praising this book were like, oh, he understands Grant. So that shows how in 1981, the general impressions of Grant were in a very different spot than they are now. And so, see, Brandon asks, well, was Grant religious? And do we have any examples? Grant was raised a Methodist. He was never overtly religious. His wife was Methodist, and she practiced a lot more. She always tried to get him to go to church. He was never an active churchgoer, but he definitely believed in a higher providence, and he believed that he had been guided by this providence throughout his life, and he often spoke of it. He simply wasn't a huge fan of organized religion at the time in terms of worshiping that way. And I'm not sure where it's at. I actually had a quote from one of his chaplains, but I'll put that in the comments for you. And what decisions did Grant make as a general or president that changed the course of the United States of America's future? And that's a question that I think could have multiple answers. Perhaps one of them is going back to that veto I mentioned, his veto of 1873, when our first Great Depression began. Up to that point, the largest economic crisis we had seen and experienced in America, with over 15 million men losing their jobs. And had he not vetoed that bill, it's just interesting to wonder what would have happened, because the other nations in Europe and throughout the world who didn't follow a similar path that we did, the Depression lasted 20 to 30 years in some places, whereas in America, you've probably heard the term the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age began with Grant's presidency, and the Gilded Age was a period, yes, of general corruption in society, unfortunately, with a lot of other politicians, a lot of corporate bribery and different things, but it was a period where there was a lot of financial success, and it really took off during the late 19th century, the Gilded Age. So had Grant not vetoed that bill, perhaps we wouldn't have had a Gilded Age, which then ushered in William McKinley in the late 1890s, and that led to his presidency. And he's often considered the one that ushered in the dawn of the American century. And then, so there's a lot we could say. But going back to the Civil War even, there were many choices that Grant made, probably 10 to 15, and I won't go through them all here. Maybe I'll give them to you later, Brandon, specifically, but there are at least 10 choices that I can think of that Grant made where he pondered it, and it was just kind of like, well, we're going to do this. Especially near the end of the war, the last 12 months of the war, there were decisions he made that could have prolonged the war, that could have altered the outcome of the war significantly. So that is a great question. The misconceptions, we've kind of talked about that one with the him being a drunkard and some of the other things. Again, if anyone has any more questions, please chat them or put them in the comments down there. Dan asks, how did Johnson ever get elected? Andrew Johnson. Well, he wasn't ever elected, actually. He was elected as Lincoln's vice president. And so when Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, they needed a candidate to appease the Copperhead Democrats, the liberal Republicans. And so they selected a Democrat. Lincoln, of course, was a Republican. He selected Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, Tennessee, to kind of appease some of the more moderates. And Andrew Johnson became vice president that way. Of course, it was only, a month after Lincoln was inaugurated that Johnson then ascended to the presidency and got very little done. And yeah, like was impeached. Definitely bottom 5 worst presidents of all time is Andrew Johnson. So if I have missed any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat again. I'm going to scan through and see what other ones I may have missed. Although I wish I had better organized some of the quotes and comments that I had about Grant. And and with Grant, it's again interesting the way that his memory in our public consciousness has changed so much. But fortunately, it is being rehabilitated now. Several biographies in the last 10 years even, there's been almost a dozen biographies that have come out defending Grant and pointing out that his presidency even, yeah, he was a great general, but even his presidency was much more successful than we've generally given him credit for. He absolutely held our country together at a time when it was tearing itself apart. In the 1870s, there were episodes of black massacres in the South, of blacks trying to vote, and even confrontations with white Ku Klux Klansmen where they would face off for weeks. And there was one, the Colfax Massacre, where the whites eventually surrounded the African Americans in a chapel, and the African Americans surrendered, and then 130 of them were massacred. And Grant immediately sent in the federal troops. At one point in Louisiana, there were many Republicans, several African Americans among them, who were elected to state office, and yet the incumbents, who were Democrats opposed to African American rights, refused to give up their seats. And Grant actually had federal troops march into the state courthouse and remove those men from their seats to help seat the duly elected African American representatives. That was actually one of the last straws for many people in the North who saw this as a literal invasion of the federal government into a state capitol building. And so that didn't go over well with a lot of politicians and others in the North, but that's how far Grant was willing to go to defend that. Dan asks, is Grant buried in Grant's tomb? Yes, the famous question, who was buried in Grant's tomb? And the correct answer is no one is buried in Grant's tomb. Grant is in a mausoleum. His casket is above ground. You can go descend into the mausoleum where you stand. The casket's raised somewhat. It's actually modeled after Napoleon's, simply because Julia, when they were on their world tour in France, she liked Napoleon's tomb, and so she had them model it after that, even though Grant himself probably wouldn't have liked it for that exact reason, because he wasn't a fan of Napoleon. But it is interesting, Grant's tomb now, it's called the General Grant National Monument. Grant was adamant that he be remembered for being a general, not president. So when you go to his tomb, to his national monument, there's no reference anywhere to his presidency. It's all a dedication to his soldiers, and it's all a dedication to the men that fought with him in his commands and the generals that he served with. Kinsey asks, who is my #1 president now? The top three actually haven't changed since I began many years ago. Washington is definitely my number one. I think it's hard to supplant Washington with anyone. He was an amazing man with what he did, without any examples to follow, without any precedent, and yet being offered all of the power in the world, he was able to remain humble and not eat up all that power, right? And he set a great precedent for the rest of the presidents. And then Lincoln, of course, is my second, and then Reagan is third on my list, with Grant being fourth. And Anne says, "Would you post your current rankings?" Well, I don't have it now, but I can provide it for you. But it is fluid, actually, and I found with a lot of the presidents, there was a lot of interesting stories to all of the presidents. Even, John Tyler, Franklin Pierce, these men whom we hardly know at all, who are considered some of the worst presidents, they still have an interesting life. They still have unique stories to tell. And that's one thing I've loved. Even, Miller Fillmore, he still is somewhat boring generally, even for me, but there are still interesting things about his life. Chester Arthur and all of these men. And so my list, it is being updated. I don't feel like I can really commit to ranking a president until I've researched about 10 to 15,000 pages on him. I can go out and read a book, and after that one book I might think, man, he's number 3, he's number 5, and then I'll read another book and I'm like, ugh, now he's down to 15 again. And so it comes down to just having a wide variety of sources. Of course, some presidents, there are only 3 books written about some. There's not a lot written about John Tyler and Franklin Pierce. I have literally every biography ever written on some presidents. But I like to study as much as I can before I commit to ranking them. So if Grant was considered as a portrait on Mount Rushmore, I don't believe he was. I haven't heard that he was. That would be interesting. Of course, because he was going for one president from each century, and he kind of felt Lincoln was the more obvious choice. And Grant would himself have easily deferred to Lincoln as well. Grant loved Lincoln, and like I said, had considered him his hero. Judd asks, "Is there a Grant presidential library?" Yes, there is. It's actually in the South. They feel that it's appropriate. It's in the Deep South. It's in Mississippi at Mississippi State University, and that's where his library is at. And why was he buried in New York? They lived in New York for several years after his presidency. They had a townhome there. Their family was kind of located there, and there was the particular, I just forgot the name of the park. It's by Columbia University. It's right by Columbia University. There was a particular spot overlooking the river, looking down to New York, that Grant just loved that spot. And so they chose to have him buried there. And Julia was adamant that she not be buried in a building with toilets. So if you go to the Grant National Monument, you can't go to the bathroom there. You've got to go across the street to the museum. You can use the restrooms there. And they also didn't want any artificial light. So to this day, there's no electric lights in the Grant National, in the tomb there. It's all very large windows around the top. It's all natural light, which is very beautiful, but also means if it's cloudy or overcast or raining, sometimes they close it because it can get darker down in the actual mausoleum where the caskets are. And so that's one reason that he was buried there. Yeah, if he's born in Ohio, why he's buried in New York. And there you go. Yeah, sorry, I must have missed that question, Jennifer, when you had asked it earlier. But if there aren't, let me see if I missed any more. And you can also ask questions at any time on this event page. Feel free to post questions, and I'll respond to them. My next lecture is scheduled for next Tuesday. I mentioned before I'm going to do one a week, as long as the coronapocalypse continues. So this gives me something to do as we're all stuck at home, and I crave connection with human beings, even though I can't see any of you. But my next one will be Tuesday, and it will be a special Titanic one, Tuesday, April 14th, as that is the anniversary. April 14th is when it sank. It will be at 7 p.m., which actually is the same time. So while we are meeting for our lecture, will be the same moments the Titanic was actually foundering in the Atlantic Ocean. It struck the iceberg about 6:38 p.m. Utah time back in 1912. So we will meet and do a memorial and tribute to Titanic, and then the week after that will be my lecture on Ronald Reagan and the Cold War and his crusade against communism, and talking about their efforts in Poland and other areas. And Crystal asks, did any of his children end up in politics at all after him? They did not. I'm trying to think of what, and I can't remember at the moment what his children ended up doing. Julia, his daughter was also named, she actually married a Briton, and so Grant, that's one reason he was crying a lot, is he was fearful he was going to lose his daughter. She was going to move to Great Britain. Luckily she didn't. But she ended up dying, I think, around 1930. So most of his children lived to about the 1920s and 1930s. And Dan asks, wasn't there a place in New Jersey that he used to go as well? And there was a lot of the presidents would I want to say flee, but they'd vacate Washington, D.C. in the late summer because it's very hot and very humid. And so Grant would often do this as well. It was actually while he was on the coast in New Jersey, where early on in his presidency, there was a couple of financiers that tried to corner Grant and trick him so that they could corner the market on gold. And Grant's own brother-in-law got in on the action. This man that married Grant's sister tried to manipulate Grant to help basically withhold the government supply of gold so that the price of gold would go up, and these men were trying to manipulate the market. And at one point Grant finally caught on and sold all of his gold, and they were broke. But he was at that place where he got a telegraph, and the way they asked the question, it was really, he just was like, well, wait, wow, this is what they're doing. It's like, and he finally realized, and so he said no, and he called this treasury and said, no, I want you to sell $4 million worth of gold right now, put it in the market. And so he saw through that. But he was in New Jersey when that happens. But Grant, certainly analyzing his life, he emerges as a more subtle thinker and a more educated and smart man than many of his contemporaries and most historians since, I think, have given him credit for. He took office at a time when the Republican Party was having to face its divided nature between the liberal and conservative Republicans, as well as the Democratic Party, who was fractured and in pieces after the Civil War. He took office at a time when the country was on the path to tear itself apart again, and they were on the path to alienate and prevent citizens of our country from receiving the God-given rights that all men had been guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence. And so I just hope that through this you've learned to appreciate that Ulysses S. Grant for who he was and for what he was able to accomplish in terms of preserving our country twice in the Civil War, and then again as president, and to respect and appreciate what he did for our country in terms of enshrining liberty and value to every human life. I will close with, hopefully I can find it. My note cards aren't always organized, but I'll just say it'll probably be quicker just to Google it. I'm going to pull up his farewell address and his final address to Congress. And one thing with Grant, it's very easy actually to get to know Grant if you simply read a lot of what he wrote, because again, he wasn't a politician, so he didn't try to obfuscate things, or he didn't try to use big fancy words to appease people in different camps or with different opinions. He was a straight shooter. He was a military man. I mean, he was, his philosophy as a military man was, you find where your enemy is, you lay on him hard, you lay on him good, and you follow him until he's defeated. I mean, it was like, he wasn't a butcher, but he recognized if you want the quickest victory, you've got to pursue it until you have it. And a lot of generals in the Civil War didn't follow this. They would have a battlefield victory, and then instead of pursuing the enemy, they would retreat, and that's why Lincoln hated his first 6 generals. He, for the first 2.5 years, couldn't find a general that he actually liked. And then Grant came around. So that was Grant's approach. Let me pull up his farewell address to Congress, which is actually very short, and his addresses to Congress and his addresses to the nation are very illuminating as well. into his character. Okay, Ulysses S. Grant farewell speech. So I'll read portions of this to you. It's again it's a very short address. It's only 2 paragraphs. So if you want to read it, you can. So he says, "It was my fortune or misfortune to be called to the office of chief executive without any previous political training. From the age of 17, I had never even witnessed the excitement attending a presidential campaign. But twice before my own candidacy, and at but one of them was I actually even an eligible voter. Under such circumstances, it is but reasonable to suppose that errors of judgment must have occurred. Even had they not, differences of opinion between the executive, bound by oath to the strict performance of his duties, and writers and debaters must have naturally arisen. It is not necessarily evidence of blunder on the part of the executive because there are these differences of views. Mistakes have certainly been made, as all can see, and I admit, but it seems to me more often than not in the selections made of the assistants appointed to carry out the duties of the government and to do their responsibilities, in nearly every case selected without a personal acquaintance but upon recommendations of other people. It is impossible, where so many trusts are to be allotted, that the right parties should have been chosen in every instance. History shows that no administration from the time of Washington to the present has been free from these mistakes. But I leave comparisons to history, claiming only that I have acted in every instance from a conscientious desire to do what was right, constitutional, within the law, and for the very best interests of the people, of the whole people, Failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent." And that was his farewell speech to Congress. I actually ended up pretty much reading the whole thing to you, but that was his farewell speech. And so as we end tonight, I didn't again see any other, and I asked the last question, do you think Reagan and Grant would be great friends? I actually do. They were both from humble beginnings. They both loved America, and they both loved military men, and they thought that way. But I would just leave you, as Grant asked we do. In his own words, I just extend that invitation from him to you, to judge whether you felt what he did was right, within the law, and for the very best interests of the whole people. And I would invite you to recognize he is a human. And so when you see the failures and misjudgments that he made, which there were several that he made throughout in the Civil War even, and throughout his presidency, mistakes were made. But I could ask you if you believe they were errors of judgment and not of intent. He always intended the best. He always intended what he felt was right. Sometimes his judgment was wrong. But thank you for your time tonight. And again, if you have any other questions later, please post them to the discussion, and I will respond to them then. But have a great night, everybody. And hopefully I will see some of you on Tuesday for our Titanic lecture. And again, if you have questions in advance, feel free to post them to that page as well, and I can prepare some responses for those. But have a great night. Thank you again.